In this program, let's explore the nature and power of the presidency, and let's go back to the Constitutional Convention. What was the nature of the debate about the presidency?
That's a great question, Sam. You know, we had just come out of our colonial period, and the revolution had been fought against the tyranny of George III. And so there was a very deep prejudice against a strong executive, and certainly an antagonism against the idea of an American king. The American people were so grateful to George Washington that they might have made him king or president for life. But Washington, in one of the great acts of statesmanship in history, retired after 2 terms as president, and in doing so really created the tradition that a president is only a person and the country is more important than the person who happens to be at the head of it. So the Founding Fathers had all this going on in their heads. Just fought a revolution. They believed in legislative supremacy, and yet under the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution, there had been no executive lead. The president had been a kind of president pro tem who served only for a year. He was little more than a figurehead. And so when they got to Philadelphia, they knew they were going to have to create an executive of greater capacity than that, and yet to stay this side of a monarchy. And they knew that the people all across America would not ratify a constitution that had too strong a president in it. So they had a lot of trouble figuring this out, and they debated it off and on all through the summer, and finally produced the system that we have.
Now, during this discussion, they actually knew that George Washington would be the first president.
That's what was so great about this, is he is the president of the Constitutional Convention, and he's sitting in front of them, and he's very stiff and formal. Washington was not a glad-handing sort of person. And everybody knew he was going to be the first president of the United States, including Washington. But nobody could admit that, especially George Washington. But now they have to talk about how presidents can become corrupt, how they can be engaged in cronyism, how they can become overly concerned with their own dignity. And they have to be very careful in the way they discuss all these things, because everybody knows that the president is sitting in front of them, and he's very thin-skinned. And so in a sense, they're trying to, not to upset him, but to sort of leapfrog over him to the time when we won't be in the hands of this glorious man any longer, and we'll have routine presidents like John Adams and Martin Van Buren. Now what?
What a remarkable situation to have been.
Washington was also in an awkward situation, Sam, because he believed, he was really steeped in classical Republican theory, and the idea was that you shouldn't be ambitious. And so he had already won the war, and after that he turned in his commission and went back to Mount Vernon, where he said, I'm retiring for the rest of my life. Well, then he's pulled out to serve as the president of the Constitutional Convention, which he thought he didn't want to do because he felt people would think that he was ambitious. Then it's clear that he's going to become the first president. It's not that he doesn't want to be the first president. I mean, he sort of knows he's the only person who can be. But he also knows that if he shows any willingness to be the first president, that might crush his historical reputation. So he has to pretend, shucks, I'd rather go home to Mount Vernon. I'm too old. This is not right. You should give me my retirement, which I've been panting for all these years. And then they have to try to read this. Does he really mean it? Does he not mean it? So it was a virtually impossible situation, almost a comic one.
You know, it sounds like a modern presidential campaign set back then without any of the commercial advertising that goes along with it.
Exactly, you know, and he was the only unanimously chosen president in American history. The Electoral College unanimously selected him as the first president. The Founding Fathers, in their most colossal mistake, Sam, did not anticipate the rise of political parties. They actually thought, in their naivete, that we were going to be a nonpartisan culture. And so they didn't anticipate the growth of party politics. If they saw what happens today in a presidential campaign, they'd believe that it's insane that you could spend half of a presidential term getting the next guy. That certainly wasn't the way it was for Washington and Jefferson. So he was unanimously chosen, but after that, the minute Washington retired, all bets were off and the party system sprang right up.
The Electoral College versus the popular vote is a debate that goes on continuously because people don't really understand the role of the Electoral College.
Well, that's a good reason. It ceased to be important after 1800. In other words, almost from the beginning. The Constitution is written in 1787. 13 years later, it's a dead letter, and it has been ever since until today. the idea wasn't as bad as it sounds. You know, people often think, oh, it's some sort of a hedge against democracy, or the people weren't really trusted. It was really more of a makeshift move, Sam, because at the time there was no media and there was no national networking. The communication systems were really weak. And so at the Constitutional Convention, people said, Gouverneur Morris, for example, said we should have direct election of the president. But then others said, how? I mean, how would somebody in Georgia even know who the candidates are? What news would they get? How would the mechanism work? So they finally decided that because the country was so huge and so spread out and the communication systems were pathetic, that they would have electors created in each state, and those electors would have more of a national consciousness, and they then would elect the president. Well, that broke down almost immediately. It turns out the country was interested in its president, and in the election of 1800, when Jefferson was elected, it was as, well, you can't say it was as important then as it is now, but the whole country talked about it. It wasn't any longer a kind of a faraway event. It was a live issue for the American people.
But would not the smaller states suffer today if you remove the Electoral College and just went to the popular vote? Wouldn't you just have to be in New York and California and Florida and it'd be over?
That's right. I mean, we have two reasons for keeping the Electoral College. One is that it does give small states a chance to be noticed in the presidential campaigns. North Dakota, even Nevada, are relatively small states compared to New York, California, and Texas. Secondly, there is a possibility that we elect person X in November and we find out 3 weeks later that he's been indicted for something awful. The Electoral College still is a last check against a disastrous choice, and then they meet and they could void the election if they really felt very strongly about it. One of the little pieces of trivia about the Constitution is that the Electoral College is not constitutionally bound to vote for the person who won the election. They could meet and say that you should be the next president of the United States if they felt like it. Now, in many states, they're tied to the winner, but the Constitution is silent on that question.
How much power does the president really have coming out of that Constitutional Convention?
It's a great question. They wanted, again, that balance. They wanted someone strong enough, but not too strong. So how do you give the president enough authority to really do what we want from a president and not turn him loose to do things that we can't stand? And it's never been figured out. What they decided, though, was that he would have to go to the Senate for some things. Appointments to the Supreme Court and other national officers have to be confirmed by the United States Senate. Treaties have to be confirmed by the Senate. The president can wage war. Let's say that Haiti attacked Florida. The president can repel that attack as commander-in-chief, but under the Constitution, he needs to go to Congress and have them declare war. So he can get us started in an emergency, but the Founding Fathers were emphatic that he needs to go straight to Congress and say, now, you're in charge because this is really the people's business. It hasn't worked out that way historically, but that's what they tried to do. They tried to hedge him in, and then they added one more really important thing. He can be impeached. He can be impeached for bribery and high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, as you know, in the history of the United States, 43 presidents, 2 have been impeached. Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, William Jefferson Clinton at the end of the last administration. Neither one convicted by the United States Senate. So Jefferson in 1819 said, even then, impeachment is a mere scarecrow, and it has turned out to be a mere scarecrow. The only president who ever left office at the insistence of the American people was Richard Nixon. He resigned so that he wouldn't be convicted in the Senate.
It may be a scarecrow, but what great theater.
It's great theater, although, you know, it's sort of even now hard to remember the Bill Clinton impeachment. It sort of was a cloud almost in American life, and not particularly serious. He certainly hadn't committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and that's one of the problems, Sam. Some people think that we need a wider impeachment clause that says, okay, maybe you didn't commit a convictable crime, but you misrepresented the American people, or you showed malfeasance, or you were an idiot, or whatever. But many people think there should be some sort of mechanism to vote no confidence, as the parliamentary systems do, on a presidency that has failed, and it would be in the interest of the country for that person to go before his term is out. But there's no widespread agreement on what to do about that.
Here's a few questions to think about and discuss. Question 1. George Washington is sometimes called the indispensable man. Why do you suppose historians think of him that way? Question 2. If we were rewriting the Constitution today, how would you change the job description of the U.S. President? Question 3. Do presidents today have too much power or too little power? Question 4. Why do you suppose Thomas Jefferson wanted to be a minimalist president? Question 5. Should the constitutional requirement that the president be born in the United States be changed? So you've talked about how much power the president has, and it's kind of a nebulous situation, really, depending on the circumstance. The question is it constitutional?
Well, no. The Constitution, in Article 2, remember Article 1, legislature, most important branch. Article 3, judiciary, least important branch. Article 2, the presidency. And as I said, they had a very hard time deciding what the president was and what he could do. They debated how long he should serve. One person said 7 years, no re-election. Another said 9 years, no re-election. There were proposals for 3 years, 15 years. I mean, people didn't know how long do you want this person to be in it, and what does it mean if you have a president who serves for 30 years? Secondly, who decides? They eventually selected popularly elected presidents. The people elect the president with the slight filtering of the Electoral College. But James Madison, who's the father of the Constitution, came with something called the Virginia Plan, which was the sort of the blueprint, and he wanted the president to be selected by Congress. And others wanted governors to select the president. I mean, nobody really knew. I mean, everyone was sort of trying to invent the presidency. We know what a monarchy looks like. We know what a dictatorship looks like. But no one had ever really tried this before, and so they were trying to figure it out, and they didn't really know what to do, so they finally sort of developed the system that we have. And then they said he has broad executive authority. In other words, he is to execute the laws that are passed by the Congress of the United States. That's a large grant of authority, but then they also enumerated certain powers, treaties, commander-in-chief. He can receive ambassadors. He can veto legislation under certain conditions, and so on.
Then let's go to Theodore Roosevelt, who became one of the most powerful presidents in the United States.
This is a story of two presidents. Let's look at two, Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt. They're exactly 100 years apart. Jefferson's the third president of the United States, 1801 to 1809. Roosevelt is the 26th president of the United States, 1901 to 1909, so 100 years apart, very tidy. Jefferson was a minimalist. He read the Constitution. He thought the president should be weak because he believed that the legislature should be in control, the people's branch. He never vetoed any act of Congress. He played a very indirect role in the country, and he defined himself absolutely at a minimum and said basically the president should only do those things which are specifically enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution and no more. Roosevelt, coming 100 years later at a very different time, said, wait a minute, first of all, that's not fun. You know, you got to have some power. You have to be able to do something. And secondly, the country needs leadership. The country can't, Congress is slow. There are two branches. There are conference committees. There are judicial review. That's cumbersome. This is a dynamic country on the cutting edge of the world. We have to have leadership, almost monarchical leadership. And so Roosevelt's view was that he was entitled to do anything that wasn't specifically forbidden in the Constitution. So think of the contrast. Jefferson, only those things specifically enumerated. Roosevelt, if it's not forbidden in plain English, I can do it, and they'll stop me if they want to.
What was the most egregious example of that?
Well, he did hundreds of them. Well, I don't know how egregious this is, but he started the National Wildlife Refuge System, and he called in his Attorney General Philander Knox and said, is there anything that would enable me to declare a bird sanctuary? And Knox said, no, there's nothing in the statutes. Roosevelt said, well, let me ask a more interesting question. Is there anything that prevents me from naming a bird sanctuary? And Knox said, well, Mr. President, no, nothing there either. He said, I do declare it. And so he created the National Wildlife Refuge System and named the first 51. He created the National Monument System. He added 150 million acres to the national forest by executive order alone. I mean, Roosevelt was really a king who reluctantly agreed to be a president. But that's how he saw himself, and he said it would be so much easier to govern this country without the Senate. Well, of course, but he was a benevolent king, but that could easily go wrong. He lived in the age of Mussolini and Hitler.
Now, where did the executive order powers come from? From the Constitution?
No, they just popped up, and by the way, they are very popular. There have been 13,461 of them. Now, an executive order is where the president sits down and writes out a little statement saying, I'm going to create a bird sanctuary, or I'm going to detain certain suspicious foreign characters, or I'm going to declare a national holiday. And so this gives the president broad legislative authority unchecked by Congress. 13,461 of them, including, for example, John F. Kennedy created the Peace Corps, not through the legislative branch, but by executive order. So if you add that to these signing statements that presidents do, where they sort of say, all right, they appropriated money for the Library of Congress, but I'm not going to spend it quite that way or in quite that quantity, we've allowed the president to just accumulate almost unbelievable amounts of power. And the only way to stop it would be we retire a president after 4 years or impeach him, or the Supreme Court would strike down his actions, or Congress would reassert itself. But the historians who look at this, Sam, say essentially presidents have gotten away with accumulating more and more and more power. And in fact, they say Congress often gives them the power. Congress often says, you handle this, and gives them powers that really belong to Congress, but it would just rather have it be done by an executive.
But where does the court of public opinion play into this, especially in the modern world?
Well, that's a really important point. The people finally do decide. Just take Bush 43, the president during the 9/11 crisis. In the aftermath of 9/11, the people essentially said, they didn't say this overtly, but they essentially said, look, protect us. If you have to do some things that we don't really like or that aren't strictly speaking constitutional, we won't ask a lot of questions. Then at a certain point, the panic wore off. People sensed that maybe things had gone a little too far. The courts were beginning to weigh in a little bit about detainees. Public opinion changed. And then they sort of withdrew some of that. It's very hard. It's not measurable. It's not in the social compact. It's not a constitutional mechanism. But they sort of withdrew some of their consent for those actions. And then the other branches of government got a little tougher about what the president was doing. And so public opinion really, really matters. Without it, presidents would run away with the country.
And also the swing that occurred within the Congress, where power changed from Republican hands to Democratic hands.
The people had spoken.
And therefore now there were suddenly committees who were doing investigations, and that also helped to sway things.
That's a separation of powers problem, but when you have a president in an international emergency with both houses of Congress in his party and of his persuasion, and a quiet court system, that's a formula for efficiency, but it's also a very dangerous moment, because that means that there's no effective check against presidential action. Well, as you know, when George Bush was in his 6th year as president, the country elected a Democratic legislative branch, and then that began to provide some minimal checks and balances. That's how the Founding Fathers wanted it, that the people have enough, they turn the country peacefully, the president he doesn't get his head cut off as you would in France or in Iran, he's not jailed, he's not shamed out of office, he's just quietly told, well, you went a little too far. And so the system does, Jefferson would say, the system does right itself.
Here are some more discussion questions. Question 6. Should the Electoral College be abolished? Why? Question 7. For what errors or crimes or behaviors should a president be impeached? Question 8. How much should a president listen to public opinion? Question 9. Do you think executive orders which are not in the Constitution are legitimate or illegitimate? Question 10. In times of crisis, domestic or international, should the president be granted more power to lead the nation? All right, let's bring up then Washington, Jefferson, and precedent.
It's really interesting because the Constitution was vague for 2 reasons. First of all, they didn't want to overplay their hand. They didn't know what we were going to need. But secondly, they really didn't know what they were doing either. I mean, they were inventing the presidency. And Washington was well aware of that. And he said to a friend, Lafayette, everything I do has to be done very carefully with an eye to the future because I'm creating the presidency. I'm creating the precedents which will establish the nature of this office. So, for example, Washington retired after 2 terms. Jefferson retired after 2 terms. Nobody dared to take a 3rd term until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then in a time of unprecedented national economic and international emergency. And then it became a constitutional amendment. Washington went, the really interesting story, Sam, Washington went up to the Senate in person to talk about an Indian treaty. And this was August 22nd, 1789. So the President of the United States decides he needs some advice and consent from the Senate. He goes up to the Senate to talk about an Indian treaty with Indians in Florida. And the Senate kept him waiting. And then they, instead of handling it the way he wanted them to, they decided, well, we're going to refer this to a committee. Washington flew into a rage and said, well, this defeats the whole purpose. I mean, why would I come here to get your advice when you're going to then keep me waiting and then not get it done? So he said, I will never be back. And no president has ever gone back. I mean, that's how things get established. Washington went up to give his State of the Union messages in person before Congress. The next president did, John Adams, but then Jefferson said, no, that's monarchical. I'm going to send mine because that's more in keeping with our idea of a Republican culture. And no president from Jefferson until Woodrow Wilson ever went back to give a State of the Union message before Congress. So these early precedents really helped to create the system. Washington sort of wanted a title. And there were all these talks about titles of nobility and other titles for our national officers led by John Adams. Congress finally said, no, that's not in the nature of this culture. So Washington didn't get a title, and there has been a kind of an American displeasure with presidents who show imperial trappings. Richard Nixon had all of his liveried people get a brand new kind of uniform that looked something like you'd see in a Gilbert and Sullivan play, and the country just laughed. And so Nixon quietly went back and restored a more democratic manner. And remember Jimmy Carter. When Jimmy Carter became president, he carried his own luggage, he stayed in people's houses, he wore sweaters and greeted people informally. The American people want a powerful president, but they don't want him to be, or her to behave like a king. And when they do, they withdraw affection and consent.
Let's talk about the role of vice president. For many, many years, people referred to the vice president as somebody who went to funerals, filled in for the president on various state occasions, but had no power until perhaps at that point where they would become the president. But that has changed dramatically.
It has changed. You know, Vice President John Nance Garner said famously that the vice presidency, quote, is not worth a pitcher full of warm spit. He said all the vice president does is wait for the president to die and go to funerals and so on. So the Founding Fathers didn't know what to do about this. You have to have somebody that can fill in, and we've had a number of assassinations and deaths in American history, so you have to have somebody who's waiting, that's already received the approbation of the people. But what do you do with him? You don't want him to be a rival to the president. You have to subordinate him, but you have to give him something to do. And so they made him, almost just searching for a job for him, they made him the presiding officer over the Senate. And as you know, the vice president appears once every term or so and presides over the Senate, and if there's a tie, he steps in and casts a vote. But other than that, he doesn't even do that. And there's always a president pro tem of the Senate. When Jefferson was the vice president under John Adams, he was so bored as the presiding officer of the Senate that he wrote to his old mentor, George Wythe, and said, I'm just going stir crazy here. I have to sit here. I got nothing to do. I think I'm going to write a manual of Senate procedure. Can you help me? So George Wythe sent him some materials, and Jefferson wrote a manual of senatorial procedure that we still use in the 21st century. But he was really only doing it because it was like doing crossword puzzles. He had to figure out something to do. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, who presided just 4 days before the Senate adjourned, and then of course McKinley was assassinated, Roosevelt said this office needs to be abolished. Recently, particularly with Al Gore, the vice president for Bill Clinton, and Dick Cheney, the vice president for George W. Bush, the vice presidents have taken on more substantive roles. But let me remind you, they are not constitutionally based. These are invented roles by the president. But Sam, let me try to close this discussion by going back to my favorite justice of the Supreme Court, Robert Jackson. He was a justice of the court when the Korean War was going on, and Harry Truman did some things that the court objected to. And he had a wonderful analysis of these. He said there are really three levels of power for the president. When he's acting within the constitutional formula, when he's doing the things that were set out for him in Article 2, he has unbelievable power, and he should. When he's doing things that are not really there, that are kind of in a twilight zone, but Congress has not done them and they need to be done, he's in a pretty good situation. But when he does things that are not at all enumerated in the Constitution and really are outside of any reasonable definition of presidential power, now he says his power is at its lowest ebb, and it's there that the people in the other branches of government will check him. So as long as he stays within those first two zones, he can have all the power he wants. But when he starts to do things that are really off limits, then he has no constitutional basis, no legitimacy for them, and that's when the other two branches and the people tend to step in and say, enough already.